everyone. I'm Sid Melcher, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I'd like to welcome you to our April Instant Issues online event, which will feature Dean Sudha Sethi from the Western New England University School of Law and Dr. Kavita Corey, who is the Ruth Lawson Professor of Politics, and Carol Hoffman Collins, Director of the Mount Holyoke College McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives. And they'll be speaking us today about national security priorities during Biden's first 100 days. Some of you will remember that Sudha Sethi spoke to us 4 years ago on a similar topic regarding the Trump administration's first 100 days. So we invited her back again, and Kavita Corey is going to join the conversation. I'd like to thank our Instant Issues series sponsors, Glen Meadow, Sir Speedy, and Wilbraham and Munson Academy. And we are especially grateful to NAI Plotkin and 1350 Main Street, LLC. We are also grateful to board member Jeremy Cole and JD Cole TV, which makes our videos available online at our website, wacwestma.org, westma.org, or on our YouTube channel. And we continue to partner with Valley Eye Radio, which will rebroadcast the audio from this program for their listeners who have low vision or print disabilities. Sudha Sethi became Dean of the School of Law in 2018 and has served on the faculty since 2006. She has taught courses in constitutional law, law on terrorism, national security, and government accountability, contracts, and business organizations. She was a visiting scholar at the University of Cape Town Faculty of Law in 2018, a Fulbright Senior Specialist at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law in 2014, and a visiting professor at the University of Connecticut School of Law in 2011. Kavita Corey, again, is a professor of politics and director of the McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives at Mount Holyoke College. Her current research explores transnational political mobilization among South Asian diaspora populations in North America and Europe. She is especially interested in analyzing both historical antecedents and contemporary debates linking migration with security in the US and countries in the European Union. She is also a past council speaker and a member of our board of directors. And I'm going to get out of the way to let Sudha Sethi and Kavita Corey speak on national security priorities during Biden's first 100 days. And I encourage you, if you have any questions, to put them into the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sid. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Sudha Sethi. She is the Dean of the Western New England School of Law, where, as Sid has mentioned, she has taught courses in constitutional law, law and terrorism, national security, and government accountability. Dean Sethi's wide-ranging scholarship analyzes the separation of powers, rule of law, and national security in comparative contexts. She has written dozens of law review articles and book chapters on national security and the rule of law. She is the editor of the book, Constitutions, Security, and the Rule of Law, and the author most recently of the book, National Security Secrecy, Comparative Effects on Democracy and the Rule of Law, published by Cambridge University Press. It's a terrific book, I might add, in which Dr. Sethi brings an invaluable comparative perspective to some of the most vexing and urgent legal and political questions of our time concerning government secrecy that is often justified on the basis of national security, and the implications of doing so, not only for the United States, but for other democracies like India and the UK. Dean Sethi has received numerous awards and honors. She received Western New England Law School's Catherine Jones Professor of the Year Award, not once, not twice, but 3 times, most recently in 2018. She is the first woman of South Asian descent to serve as Dean of an ABA-accredited law school. As Sid mentioned, the last time Dean Sethi spoke at the World Affairs Council, she gave a talk on national security and civil liberties in the Trump administration. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dean Sethi back, this time to talk about President Biden's national security priorities. Dean Sethi will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will open up for Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Dean Sethi. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Corey, for that really kind and generous introduction. And many thanks to Sid for inviting me to speak here. As both Dr. Corey and Sid mentioned, I gave a talk 4 years ago, which in some senses will be very similar to the talk I give today, in the sense that it is talking about a new administration with very different priorities than its predecessor. And in some senses, the sameness will also arise from the fact that in the world of national security, things don't always, policies don't always change as quickly as one might think. And folks who are kind of labeled as progressive or liberal in one sphere does not necessarily carry over into the national security sphere in the same way. So some things have changed and some things have most certainly stayed the same. So we will talk about that, as Dr. Corey said, in the next 15 minutes or so. And then I'd be happy to field questions or discuss any aspects of that where folks would like to have more conversation. So my plan over the next 15 minutes is to do a few things in framing our discussion about the first 100 days of the Biden administration with regard to national security priorities and also thinking about civil liberties. First, I'll talk a little bit about the Biden administration's kind of structural approach to dealing with national security. How have they positioned themselves, and what do the internal mechanisms of government look like now? Second, I'll touch on some aspects of foreign policy and how that affects counterterrorism law and policy more generally. And again, in some areas, there have been some very significant changes and very little changes in other areas. And third, I'll talk about domestic terrorism and national security threats and the administration's kind of challenges that are in front of it on how to address that. So I'll start here with this question of structure and how it is that the Biden administration has looked at the operations of national security law and policy and its posture towards other branches of government and the international community as well. So a lot of this can be put under the category of reversions to old norms or pre-Trump era norms. So the Biden administration, since inauguration, it can be viewed as really walking back certain aspects of the Trump administration's approach to how to position itself. And the Trump administration's approach was very much focused on kind of testing norms and testing old boundaries. The Biden administration is very much not doing that, right? So the Trump administration, I think, pushed outward on other branches of the federal government, pushed against Congress, curtailing his national security priorities, pushed on the courts and claimed that there was an inability for courts to review many national security related policies that former President Trump had chosen to pursue. So what you see in the Biden administration, perhaps unsurprisingly, is a reversion to the pre-Trump posture of accepting judicial review, accepting the authority of the courts, accepting even that authority when it's finding that what the Biden administration has done is illegal or unconstitutional. And we can think about that early test of this administration in the Biden administration trying to put a stay on certain types of deportations. And when a federal judge put an injunction in place, said, you can't put this stay right now, you have to continue forward with the policy. For now, that the Biden administration accepted that determination of the judge, even though it disagreed heartily with it, thereby kind of reverting to this norm of accepting judicial review and judicial power in these contexts. I think likewise, if we think externally, the Trump administration certainly pushed outwards on international and global norms, specifically in the national security sphere. In 2017 and 18, we saw the Trump administration either skipping or downplaying meetings that were related to national security, whether they were convened by NATO or another multinational body, skipping conversations related to human rights when it comes to border control and migration, questioning the value of intelligence sharing agreements or claiming that those agreements were somehow suspicious because they really, in former President Trump's view, were meant to spy on him or kind of denigrate him or his family. And kind of this larger project of questioning the utility of organizations like NATO. And I think that the Biden administration has made a really great show of being very different than that. And it's a choice of words and language and its overall approach, right? It has reverted to a much more globalist stance, making a big show of valuing diplomacy and deal making as key tools available to the State Department, and making clear that it was valuing a kind of multilateralist approach to global problems of security. And if we look back over the last 30 years of foreign policy, if we look at the administrations of George H.W. Bush to Clinton, to George W. Bush, to Obama, that's the kind of approach, setting aside the actual specifics and substance of the policy, that's more of the posture and approach that Biden is taking. And I think no surprise, right? These are the things that Biden promised to do when he ran for office, right? We were going to bring back certain norms and certain approaches. He talked a lot about rebuilding support with allies and again, this multilateralist and globalist conversation about security and about foreign policy. And so we see a lot of that coming through in the external posture. And the last thing I'll say about this is the Biden administration's kind of hiring, who they have put in various positions. And here, I think we see the ones that are publicly known, right? The ones that need Senate confirmation. These are lots of really experienced folks, many of whom have worked under previous administrations, who he's bringing back in to run State Department, key State Department positions, National Security Council positions, and other places where you see this role of reestablishing the United States on the global stage. And, again, this is something that he promised to do, to rebuild these institutions that had fallen into some neglect during the Trump administration. Many career officials who had worked in Republican and Democratic administrations over decades had resigned over the course of the Trump administration due to political pressures and various other stresses that were occurring on their jobs. They had either not been replaced at all or being replaced by folks with very little relevant experience in the field. So Biden going back and kind of reestablishing those parts of the administrative agencies is, I think, a key part of reassuring external forces and allies that indeed the United States was going back to this more multilateralist and globalist approach. And I think what this does for Biden is it fulfills his campaign promise to do this, but it also allows him a lot of room for movement, right? He can move foreign policy in different directions relatively quickly if he has experienced folks in those positions, but he also has more political room, right? He has created a lot of goodwill in the international community simply by restaffing these agencies with folks who have more relevant experience. And the kind of extremes of the Trump administration have created space for him to make choices on the foreign policy stage with these experienced personnel that he might not otherwise have been able to do had he been succeeding an Obama administration directly or something along those lines. So the next piece that I want to talk about is kind of foreign policy oriented things. Where do we see changes? Where do we see some consistency? And where are there understandably some question marks? We are not even quite at that 100-day mark for the Biden administration. So I'm sure there's a lot to be seen that yet to be seen when it comes to foreign policy. But I want to focus on a couple of things here. One is a recently issued threat assessment that came out some days ago from the U.S. intelligence community. This is a regular reporting mechanism that's used to kind of highlight what the intelligence community believes are the highest global threats that exist out there for the United States. And so we see some changes from the Trump administration's issuance of these threats. Not so much an entirely different change in what those threat assessments look like, but certainly a change in the emphasis, right? In the most recent threat assessment, we see a heavy emphasis on climate change and climate security as a key national security threat that will be occurring both in the United States and in many parts of the world. that could create destabilization in ways that give rise to other types of security threats that we also have to think about. We see an increased focus and emphasis on Russia as a national security threat, detailing kind of particularly Russian foreign policy, Russian actions in terms of alleged poisonings of dissidents and whatever else that are occurring outside of Russian soil. And also more recently, if we think about the buildup of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border that has been in the news a lot in the last few days, right, that is within Russia's borders, but clearly acknowledging the idea that there's a larger security threat that is potentially to be seen there. And then we also see, I think, a continuation of the Trump era threat assessments that talk about Iran, North Korea, and China, right? That is continuing through with the most recent threat assessments that are coming forward. And then an interesting piece that, again, it was not entirely absent under the Trump administration, but certainly downplayed to a strong extent, is the most recent global threat assessment talking about white nationalist violence as a global and transnational security threat. And I'll talk a little bit more about the domestic piece of that arising from January 6th and beyond in a minute. But this is part of the global threat assessment. So this is a key difference to what the Trump administration tried to create as in terms of its foreign policy narrative. And actually, in some ways, a different approach than what occurred under the Obama administration as well, right? There was internal reporting from the Department of Homeland Security about white nationalism as a domestic and foreign threat. There was immediate political pushback to that. And so the Obama administration tried to downplay it, even in light of things like the 2011 mass shooting in Norway by Anders Breivik, right, which made a lot of intelligence analysts around the world think about this kind of connected global threat of white nationalist violence. Even with that existing, right, the Obama administration was not able to kind of elevate white nationalist violence up as a kind of global security threat at that time. And so I think this is a marked difference, frankly, from the last two administrations, and seeing this play a prominent role in what the Biden administration views in terms of global threats. And what the intelligence community feels comfortable saying to the Biden administration and beyond in terms of its assessment of threats. Obviously, another significant change that made a lot of news yesterday and today, right, this drawdown of troops in Afghanistan that now President Biden is saying will occur fully by September 11th of this year, right? Obviously, choosing this very symbolic date in order to say 20 years into the event that prompted the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, we're going to eliminate having combat troops there. This is a change in the sense that President Trump had promised the drawdown of troops. He had promised it by May 1st of this year, actually, when he was still in office. This pushes that back by a few months. But both under President Trump and President Biden with this recent announcement, I think there is a lot of kind of conflicting opinion and messaging in terms of whether this is long-term a good move or something that is going to lead to greater destabilization. And we can just think about a few of the national security concerns that have been raised even in the last 24 hours about this decision announced by the Biden administration. I think a lot of what's getting reported in the Western news media is about the potential of a resurgent Taliban that is going to then pose a direct threat to the United States, right, along the lines of the September 11th attacks in 2001. And the United States has tried, the Biden administration has tried to put out a lot of messaging in the last day talking about how it will still have a significant intelligence presence, right, without detailing really what that is, that will help it detect and prevent such an kind of mass atrocity event from occurring again. I think the other two aspects of this, right, the risk that a resurgent Taliban is going to pose more of a physical threat and risk either within Afghanistan to the people who live there or to neighboring countries in that part of Asia. I think that there's less emphasis of that in the Biden administration's view, right? It's articulating less concern about that, and perhaps even an acceptance that that is going to occur given the US's decision making here. And then I think the third aspect of that to think about is the risk of erosion of human rights gains that have been accrued marginally and very fragilely by women and other historically marginalized groups and oppressed groups in Afghanistan. And I think here the administration has acknowledged the loss of those gains as a real possibility that will occur. Honestly, here, I think that the history of the last 20 years has led this administration to think that they're in some senses willing to cede this ground, knowing that how fragile the gains have been, that whenever it is that the US left Afghanistan, whether it's May or September or 4 years from now, that it was going to be a case that they were going to lose human rights progress and human rights grounds whenever that occurred. And I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration, by making this decision, and perhaps the Trump administration before it, has seen the US as perhaps having succeeded in some aspects of its original mission in Afghanistan, but having failed in the larger kind of democracy building goals that had been articulated, particularly from 2003 to 2010, with the initial invasion, occupation, and then the surge that came, surge of troops that came early in the Obama administration. And I think in the backdrop of this, and this is reported widely in the last couple of days, are the lessons to be taken from the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan that ended in the late 80s, the British invasion and occupation there in the early 20th century, and this kind of belief that additional time and resources being put into Afghanistan would likely not lead to a different end result in terms of these longer term democracy building goals that had been articulated previously. But hopefully enough work has been done to mitigate the risk of the mass atrocity, the risk of further terrorist attacks or mass atrocities coming out of Afghanistan and affecting US interests, however that's defined. A few things that have not changed in terms of foreign policy. The kind of emphasis on cybersecurity as a key priority for the administration, the emphasis on intelligence sharing relationships. Those were, I think, kind of strained under the Trump administration, but they are, I think, being rebuilt by this administration. And targeted killings is something I did want to touch base on as well. We currently have the same framework in place under the Biden administration as the Trump administration, an extremely broad authority. I was a critic, as Dr. Corey perhaps alluded to earlier. I've been a critic of both of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration when it comes to targeted killings through drone attacks or otherwise. I've been arguing for many years that there's not enough transparency when it comes to how decisions are made on whom to target. That there is not enough accountability and control in place on that decision making. The height of control and accountability existed thus far in the Obama administration. The Trump administration basically would not release numbers on how many people were being killed in targeted killings. It decentralized the decision-making authority for who got to choose when to issue the order for a drone strike, and kind of masked the entire thing in secrecy. And the Biden administration, I think that the best guess now as to where it is going on this, and it has not yet fully implemented these changes, but that it'll probably walk back some of the more extreme portions of the Trump administration's policy, but not all the way back to where Obama was, that we are not going to see kind of the same level of transparency and accountability that was there under Obama. And here again is a situation where Biden has the political space to do this, right? He's walking back some of the things that have been viewed as quite egregious under the Trump administration, but he has this space. He will be on the receiving end of critique from the left and those of us who would like to see more accountability and transparency here, but he has enough political space to choose a different path than Obama, somewhere maybe halfway between where Obama and Trump were, and still be considered someone who has championed human rights because he will be moving away from the previous policy. I think yet to be seen are things related to that policy. Yet to be seen is also things related to detention and trial at Guantanamo, right? A lot of this has been thrown into upheaval due to the pandemic, but certainly there's changes that the Biden administration is expected to make there to try to deal with the remaining 40 individuals who are being detained there at enormous cost, and with not to mention the kind of overarching human rights concerns that with their kind of potentially endless detention there without trial for at least some of them. Okay, and I'm looking at the clock here, and I want to make sure I get to my last piece before opening it up for questions, and that really has to do with domestic security. We saw right early in the Biden administration a slew of executive orders that were undoing essentially executive orders that President Trump had put into place with regard to entry requirements for travelers. He left in place some of the COVID era protocols that had been in place under the Trump administration, and those will probably persist for some time. I think in the area of domestic national security issues, I think one of the biggest questions here is in light of the events of January 6th at the U.S. Capitol, the kind of, what has been described as a riot or a mob or an insurrection. Again, this kind of recent threat assessment that identifies white nationalist violence as a serious national security threat, how it is that the law or policy ought to change. And here, I think there are a couple of avenues that are available to the Biden administration, and we don't have kind of full clarity on what will happen with that. I think it's fair to say that U.S. law is structured deliberately, that it's likely, there are about 400 people who've been brought up on federal charges at this point in relation to those January 6th events. None of them are likely to be terrorism-related charges. Maybe the people, if they're charged with regard to the folks who put pipe bombs in the DNC and RNC buildings. But the folks who are kind of causing damage and havoc, instilling fear in the people in the Capitol building, it's very unlikely that they will be brought up on terrorism charges, right? That's just not the way U.S. law is structured. And so they're being charged with the underlying crimes, right? Whether they are assault related or conspiracy to commit a crime, conspiracy to obstruct justice. I think you have a significant number of charges in those categories. And I think there's an interesting moment, right? A lot of folks who have observed, the last almost 20 years, and frankly, even beyond that, of how national security law has operated, have seen very much the fact that there's been a big disparate impact of national security law and policy on people who are Middle Eastern or Muslim or South Asian, or who present as such, right? And how they're perceived by law enforcement, by the FBI, by intelligence agencies, or even by their neighbors, right? How we think about the disparate impact of law and policy. And a lot of kind of initial reaction of, should these folks who raided the Capitol on January 6th, who come from very different demographic groups for the most part, should they be treated similarly, right? Should we view them as national security threats and engage in the same types of really very aggressive law enforcement intelligence tactics that we do in other contexts? And some folks are saying that, what we need is a new domestic terrorism statute to enable that kind of treatment of these folks for criminal charges and for detention and surveillance and whatever else. I think a lot of other people, and I'll count myself in this category, are deeply concerned about a federal terrorism statute that empowers law enforcement and the intelligence community to do more in terms of what could be a potential abuse of power or overreach, even if the initial folks who would be likely to be charged under this statute are the people who are engaging in acts like that of January 6th. I think history over the last 30, 40 years has shown us that when you put into place a statute like that, in all likelihood, the uses of that statute are not going, they're going to end up creating potential abuses of power against the same communities that have been already over-policed and over-surveilled in the name of national security for the last several decades. And instead, many folks, and I'll include myself in this, have been advocating simply for a change in policy and focus by the Biden administration to put more resources in the hands of the FBI divisions that are already tasked with monitoring and trying to understand and prevent white nationalist violence, to give them resources and to make it a real priority as part of the conversation, which simply has not been seen previously, to acknowledge this as a national security threat and to treat it as such, but not necessarily with more legal authority, simply with more resources that still keep in place the safeguards that we'd like to keep in place for people in the United States in the first place, which is why we don't have that kind of overarching domestic terrorism statute. So we'll see where the Biden administration chooses to go with this, right? In my view, kind of importing the norms that the U.S. uses in the kind of foreign and international terrorism context and just using them domestically is probably going to lead to an erosion of all of our rights. And so I'm hopeful that they will have a much more tailored approach to how they think about domestic terrorism and how they think about white nationalist violence. And kind of put their money towards those and resources towards enforcing the policies that already exist. But we yet to be seen, right, what direction the administration goes there. So I will wrap up here in the interest of time, but I'm glad to discuss whatever people want to talk about in terms of the Biden administration's, what they've done thus far or what they think they'll be doing in the near future.
Great. Thanks so much, Dean Sethi. That was terrific. And you've got a bunch of questions already. So the first one I'm going to start with relates directly to your comments on targeted killings. And this one is from Stephen Spellman, who asks, under the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, the military's Joint Special Operations Command conducted targeted killings around the world. This was based in part on the justification that those killed were terrorists who were using the world as a battlefield, and thus those individuals could be targeted and killed outside of Iraq or Afghanistan. Do you believe President Biden will continue this policy? And does the prospective departure of U.S. forces from Afghanistan change the legal analysis regarding the policy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think to the first part of it, I do think that that's going to continue to be the policy, right? This very broad definition of a global battlefield in the war on terror, right? Putting that in air quotes, right? That has been the predicate, right? That has allowed for essentially these extrajudicial killings, which we don't normally allow, right? Normally under both international law and domestic law, we don't allow for one government to kind of unilaterally decide, this person needs to be killed. And so we're going to go to another country and kill them, right? Like these are our fundamental treaties. And it is really this question that's been asked, redefining the world as a battlefield allows for a different set of legal norms to come into effect that says, okay, under normal circumstances, we don't allow for this kind of killing, but this is battlefield killing, right? It is not, our theater of war is the world. And so I do expect that to continue. I expect the Biden administration to rely on that in order to give it the space and the flexibility that it would like in order to have wide-ranging authority that sits beyond the reach of the courts, right? In determining whether these killings are legal or not. And then the second piece is 100% of that question is 100% related to the first piece, right? Once you define the theater of war to be global, then this drawdown of troops in Afghanistan allows the U.S. to have the flexibility of potentially using targeted killings there, right? In a way that they have done in a limited fashion. They could ramp it up to do it much more frequently if they decided that this was a piece that was really important in terms of the main priority of forestalling a Taliban planning attacks on the West, right, on the U.S. or European interests, which is I think what they're going to be focusing on.
Great, thanks so much. The second question here relates to the US's departure from Afghanistan and comes from Ken First, who asks, please comment on how the US will permit Afghans who have supported the US mission, as those who worked at the embassy, will be permitted to immigrate to the US for their safety.
Yeah, this has been a really contentious issue over the last several years, right? U.S. Policy had been for many years that folks who were, in an occupied space, whether it be Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere else, that they would have, if they were assisting U.S. Troops or assisting the U.S. government in its efforts, and thereby putting themselves at significant risk, right, that they would be able to have access to speedy immigration status to allow them to come to the United States with their families, and in terms of frankly, not just like a privilege or something, but a basic human right, that they were going to be in physical danger once the U.S. left these countries. I think the Trump administration came under a lot of fire from the global community and within its own organizations, right? There were a tremendous number of resignations at the State Department and elsewhere when the Trump administration stopped doing this for a lot of folks who were helpful to the U.S. government. And a lot of people who had served in the government, again, appointed perhaps by a previous Republican administration, found this to be a step too far. So I do think the Biden administration is likely to bring back that piece of allowing for speedy immigration of these folks to the United States in order to protect them, in order to reestablish the norms that were there pre-Trump administration of how the U.S. dealt with individuals who were helpful when it was putting themselves in a very precarious position.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Gary Lefort, and it changes the venue a little bit. Is the Biden administration at the edge of a national security cliff as Russia, North Korea, China, especially in terms of the South China Sea and Taiwan, and Iran increase their challenges to U.S. global influence, both politically and militarily?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think that what you see here is perhaps unsurprising in a lot of respects, given what has occurred over the last 4 years in the Trump administration and the challenges that are in front of the Biden administration now. So very, if we think about this specifically, you see a Trump administration that when it comes to Russia was unwilling to engage in, some members of the administration had kind of tougher stances on Russia than President Trump himself did, right? But he himself was very much of, I would say at best, mixed messages in terms of how to deal with Russian aggression in a lot of forms. So I think unsurprising that Vladimir Putin in this moment sees vulnerability in the United States with a change in transition, with a kind of newness of the Biden administration trying to reestablish its own kind of State Department, reestablish expertise in a lot of different areas. And it sees this moment of vulnerability and it wants to test this administration. I think you see the same thing with regard to Taiwan and China, right? This notion of the Biden administration having to make a choice, right? If we're changing a lot of things about our foreign policy, is this kind of halfway, some people would describe it as wishy-washy. Some people would describe it as thoughtfully nuanced, right? This kind of in-between position that the U.S. has put itself in Taiwan with regard to Beijing and Taiwan. Are they going to continue that, right? How far, and China in particular, I think, has been very savvy about trying to see moments at which the U.S. Perhaps is a little weaker when it comes to its foreign policy and its resources, like, even related to the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, right? Like China for years was like, if the U.S. focus of time, energy, and money is over there, then there's less focus on what we're doing, right? And so they view this as an opportunity to exercise and flex some muscle on the globalist front. And so, yes, right, the Biden administration has a very tricky decision to make there. And then finally, talking about North Korea, right, and Iran, right, these two threats that are in place, right, a great deal of instability in both places. And especially now when we think about Iran and dealing with the very recent events of, potentially an Israeli infrastructural strike, right, that has set back their nuclear development program. These things are all connected, right? They are a new administration that's trying to get its feet under it. There are foreign powers that are trying to flex at a moment where they say weakness and a lack of continuity in the United States. And my best guess on this is that you would, see a few things, right? One is probably a continuation of this kind of like middle ground navigation on the issue of Taiwan. I think that for the Biden administration, they could probably do that for a stretch of time and allow for them to focus on other more pressing issues, which I would put in the category of Russia and potential aggression in Ukraine as one of them, Iran and potential re-engagement with some sort of nuclear agreement, right? Trying to think through that piece of it. I would see those as kind of front burner priorities that they need to look at. And the Taiwan issue, if they can push it back, even a year to buy themselves a little bit more time, I think that would be my best guess as how they would proceed. But I think the description of a national security cliff is absolutely apt in these circumstances.
Great, thanks. I'd like to follow up a little bit and focus specifically on China. In many respects, and you alluded to this in your own comments, China looms large in terms of national security threats, threat assessments, all of those things. And now I think we hear that China there's the new bipartisan consensus. There's bipartisan consensus on very little, but there seems to be a consensus on the China threat. I'm wondering if you think that is an accurate way to think about national security priorities, particularly vis-a-vis China, or is this in some ways an exaggerated threat? And that could sort of pose its own set of consequences, because we're seeing some pushback on this, but it's more, at this point, it seems sort of peripheral to the major debates on national security policy taking place within the administration, but also outside of it.
Yeah, I think that is a terrific question, and it's complicated, right? I mean, on the one hand, we can see specific areas where I think there is an actual kind of disruption in global security, right, that might be occurring. And that is part of China's strategy, right? We see this not just with Taiwan, but also in its kind of, the contestation of aspects of the Indian border over the last couple of years, right? There's been flare-ups that, I think are very different in some respects to what had come previously to that. And so there are, I think, real pieces of this that are significant threats that need to be looked at. I also think, though, that it's very convenient and easy in certain respects, as you said, Dr. Corey, when there is a bipartisan consensus that China is a threat, right? What does that mean? It means that it's very likely for Congress to be willing to allocate a lot of resources, right, for a Biden administration or any other administration to do a lot of what it wants to do with regard to foreign policy here with very little questioning, because this is an area that Americans can all agree on. I mean, I think it is a basic political theory here, right, that when you can rally around a cause that is external and you are able to gain the resources and political goodwill to do it, don't waste that opportunity as a politician, right? So, and I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I do think that rhetorical piece is an important one in terms of not necessarily, how threatening or how imminent the threat is from China, but how the Biden administration wants to get political buy-in for its larger foreign policy project.
Okay, so I would like to just sort of following up a little bit in terms of foreign policy priorities. One of the things that we haven't really talked about over here is democracy promotion and human rights. I think you referred to the human rights piece of it in your comments. And I think in some senses, it's ironic that the United States should be talking about democracy promotion, given what we've seen in this country, both around the elections as well as the Capitol riots of January 6th. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this being a foreign policy priority.
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? I think that the Trump administration made a really big show of talking about America first, right? And that our project should not be to go out into the world and build democracies elsewhere. And the Biden administration has interestingly, I think, echoed some pieces of that, right, with what it's talking about thus far. I mean, this question of the drawdown in Afghanistan and that I think acknowledgement that, right, this piece about democracy building and human rights building was simply not going to be at the forefront of the decision making in terms of drawing down these troops. Likewise, I think what you said is exactly right. The kind of not just the November election and the January 6th riots, right, but you also have this kind of larger piece of human rights when you have the Black Lives Matter movement gaining a lot of global focus in 2020. More recently, a focus on anti-Asian bias incidents and hate crimes in the United States is fodder for a lot of countries. Like, Vladimir Putin has come out and talked about Black Lives Matter being evidence that the United States cannot go out and export some sort of grand idea of human rights and democracy, because clearly we haven't made it work here, right? This puts President Biden in a very difficult position in the sense that he is someone who has made a kind of, a stated commitment to human rights and the re-engagement with human rights norms. But I think from a weakened position, right, on the global stage of being able to say we are an exemplar of that, right? That wonderful political rhetoric that we've been hearing for 40 some years about like the shining beacon on the hill and whatever else, right? That's hard to do when the images of a Confederate flag, roaming around our Capitol building, or someone using an American flag to assault a Capitol police officer, right? Or the killings of historically oppressed communities, unarmed people in this country, whether they're Black or Latino individuals being harmed by police officers, or a lack of ability to protect other marginalized communities, right? So it's coming from, it's not that the message is no longer there from the Biden administration, but it's coming from such a weakened state, right? And people like Putin are trying to take advantage of that, for sure.
Thank you. And we've got about 2 or 3 more questions coming in. So the next one is from Bonnie Mannix. You describe the Trump administration as pushing boundaries with regard to policy, and that the Biden administration appears to be reverting to pre-Trump norms or times. In your opinion, was the Trump administration an outlier? Or were there recognizable characteristics from any other presidential administration in U.S. history?
So that's a fair question. So I think that in some senses, the Trump administration was pushing as an outlier in the kind of explicit nature of pushing against norms, right? Very explicitly saying, I don't care how people did this in the past, this is how I'm going to do it now, which is not as common, right, for US presidents to engage in that kind of rhetoric. I do think some of the more inflammatory language that the former president used, I think that was an outlier, although not entirely unknown, right? If you look back and hear audio tapes of President Nixon speaking about, African Americans or people from religious minorities, like there's a lot of inflammatory language in those audio tapes from back then. So I want to say that President Trump was kind of in his kind of flamboyance, right, in defying norms. I think he was perhaps more open and an outlier in that regard. But in some of those senses, right, this kind of accrual of executive power, pushing back against judicial review, a lot of that has existed, especially, I want to say, in the national security space, right? Because that's really what we're talking about here. That's existed for many, many administrations, right? That piece is not new. The definition of the globe as a battlefield, such that targeted killings could be allowed, right? That was a legal construct that came out of the Obama administration most fully, and so. Building on that, Trump is not building that out of nowhere, right? He might be stretching the boundaries of some pieces of that, but he's not coming out of nowhere. And in terms of the pieces of his rhetoric that were focused on xenophobia, that were focused on other aspects, again, maybe it's an outlier in the years of 2015 to now in terms of what we hear, but it's not new, right? We can look all the way back to the founding of this country to talk about outliers and who's viewed as acceptable to be treated well and not. That's baked into our Constitution and comes forward from there. And the xenophobia is made very clear in very early on, in exclusion acts that come out against the Asian community in the late 1800s onward, right? So again, perhaps aspects of that rhetoric and kind of the explicit pushing on norms is new, but the underlying attempt to accrue power and sometimes in the name of xenophobia, that part is not new.
Thank you. We've got several questions here, and I'm going to take some questions from audience members who haven't asked any as yet. So the first one is from Christina Cronin. As far as the border goes, does USAID do any work in Central America to improve quality of life so we can limit migration?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we're talking about what I think is yet another enormous challenge for the Biden administration right now, which is dealing with migration at the southern border with Mexico, right? I think USAID and a lot of other government agencies have been trying to do work in that area. I believe, Vice President Harris was recently tasked with kind of working with the governments of Honduras and Guatemala and other countries to think about these root causes of migration and how to deal with that. And, it's both, I think, a really important acknowledgement of where the work needs to occur to deal with the migration crisis, but also, in some senses, a task that is not manageable. This is not something she can wrap up in 2 or 3 years and say, okay, put a nice bow on it, right? It is tremendously difficult in these countries that have been struggling with a great deal of corruption, with a great deal of human rights abuses that have gone completely unchecked. A lot of private violence, right, that is either kind of sanctioned by the state or allowed by the state in terms of organized crime. That is leading to this mass migration of folks. So yes, USAID does some work there. It needs to do a lot more work. There needs to be a lot more resources there. I'd be curious to see what flexibility Vice President Harris has there and helping to fashion incentives for those governments to do something very different than what they've been doing now to help deal with crime issues and humanitarian issues such as lack of access to water and food that is driving people to be economic migrants, even if they're not directly affected by violence.
Great. I think maybe we have time for a couple more, and it's back to China. And the question is from Helene Murthy. China's influence in Africa and other areas is increasing because of the Belt and Road project. How should the USA respond to this challenge?
Yeah, this is a really good question. This feeds right back to what we were talking about a little while ago, right? China has taken advantage of the fact that the U.S. has been occupied elsewhere, right? Both by this very long war in Afghanistan and, involved in that numerous conflicts and this kind of global policing role that the U.S. has taken on that China has not. And the last, in addition to that kind of ongoing project of the U.S., we also have the last 4 years in which, the Trump administration specifically said, our job is not to kind of like engage the entire world. And, we're really thinking about America first, whatever that means. So these two things have been really beneficial to China's kind of global diplomacy project, right? It's both the things that the question asker is referring to, the investment in infrastructure in a lot of different countries, even now doing a lot of vaccine diplomacy, right? Agreeing to ship out tons of vaccine to countries that have not been able to access it through the COVAX agreements yet, trying to send out medical aid and help to countries that are struck by the pandemic, right? This is a very intentional global project from China that they have been gotten a significant amount of success with in Africa, in parts of the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere to really improve diplomatic standing. So what should the U.S. do in response to this? Well, I think there are a couple of things to be considered, right? One is this question of whether the US wants to actually invest in the same way that China does in other countries. The second is whether, unlike China's model of making deals with the government of countries, whether the US would be better off working with NGOs and kind of more grassroots movements, right? There's a wariness of getting involved in democracy building projects, but there's also something to be said for working with individuals and individual communities, even on infrastructural needs, right? And whether the US should get involved on that level. And then I think the third option is to think about whether the U.S. can be a leader in the global community in a different way. Like, can it lead the UN or NATO or another organization in which it has tremendous influence to do work that would be beneficial to these areas of the world that would then provide some geopolitical benefits to the U.S. in the long run as well. So I think lots of different aspects of that are potential for the U.S. government. It's a question of whether they want to invest, again, the resources, and by that I mean expertise and money, into doing that in different parts of the world.
Okay. The next one is a question from David Sanborn. We are in a struggle against authoritarian powers, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, for world power and influence. The next war will not be fought with tanks, battleships, aircraft, but with cyber attacks. How do we develop the capability to launch cyber attacks and defend against them, and do so with the transparency that democracy demands?
Oh boy, right. A really important and a very big question, right? So I think, cybersecurity has been the focus of a national state of emergency for a long time in this country. And what that legal designation of a national emergency does is it frees up money and also more authority to the government to try to deploy resources to meet these needs. I would say that the U.S. has been successful in some respect in doing this, but not entirely successful, right? We hear about enough failures to know that there are breaches in it. Although if you speak to people in the intelligence community, they'll say, we get 99.9% of the threats that are out there. You hear about this tiny fraction of them, but we are largely very good at what we do here. So I think a couple of things, right? One is that I don't foresee this kind of state of emergency around cybersecurity changing anytime soon. So it means that there'll be a continuation of engagement of time, energy, expertise, and resources. I think the US could do a lot more in terms of working with the folks who have expertise in these areas. And I think this is one of these areas where the Biden administration and President Biden's kind of overt commitment to multilateralism and globalism can actually help a great deal, right? You have really strong intelligence sharing agreements that are already in place with a bunch of nations, right? You have the Five Eyes agreement. Then you have a bunch of unilateral or bilateral treaties and agreements in place with Israel and other entities as well. So what do you do with this, right? You have the potential here for exporting technology and knowledge to governments that you choose to engage with, right? Particularly, I think in the Five Eyes group, right? There's a lot of shared expertise and intelligence. This being the UK and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, right? Thinking together globally about this and trying to see if there's a way to use that kind of multilateral approach to dealing with cybersecurity threats. And, the question was both defensive and offensive. I think thus far we've seen more reporting, at least, of the defensive use of cybersecurity for the U.S. against its government systems and against private company interests. And there are private-public partnerships that help support that. I think the offensive use is something that the U.S. has been reluctant to kind of associate its name with, right? So it has kind of stood in the background for the last couple of times that Israel has been accused of, deploying some sort of cybersecurity attack in one form or another against Iran or another country. There's, I think, a widely understood situation that the U.S. has provided some of the technological background in order to enable those things to happen, but has very specifically distanced itself from being named as one of the kind of instigators of that, right? And I don't see that approach changing either, right? I don't think President Biden wants to be kind of known for the person who's launching cyber attacks worldwide. I think both his kind of personal individual style and what he wants the administration to look like is much more kind of superficially, we weren't a part of this, right? Even if the reality looks a little bit different. So I see a continued approach in that area as well.
Okay, maybe we have time for just one question, and there are 2 or 3 others as well. I'm just going to read this in the order that it came in from Ken First, and it's, what is the effect of the apparent potential joining of right-wing Jewish religious parties with Islamic parties in Israel on politics in Israel and the world scene?
Wow, that is another one that requires a lot of conversation and thought. It will be really interesting to see. I mean, part of me wonders, and this is me speculating, I will say up front, I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form on how Israeli politics operates, but I think speculating here a little bit, I wonder how much of this is related specifically to the very unstable position of Israeli government over the last couple of years, with Netanyahu not having he's still kind of under the cloud of these corruption charges, this inability to kind of form a functioning government. And so I wonder how much of this is kind of convenient political bedfellows that will fall apart in the next year or so. But for now, I think, again, there's a huge question mark in terms of what that means for global security and what that means in terms of global priorities. It's hard for me to imagine that particular political coalition that it holds for that long. But again, I'm not an expert in that area.
Okay, I think we're sort of going to the end of our time over here. So thank you very much, Dean Sethi, for an absolutely terrific conversation. And we really did take you around the world and back. And I want to thank our audience for their excellent questions. And I think we could have stayed here and kept chatting about foreign policy and national security all afternoon. So thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Sid now for the final comments.
I'll just say thank you both. This has been an excellent program, and you've really covered so many topics, and I'm grateful to both of you. Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody for tuning in.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.